This playlist collects together and organizes the component sections of the lecture on the chapter Singer's Solution to World Poverty. It's in Rachel's Do the Right Thing. Since we already know a little bit about Singer from the lecture on racial discrimination, we're going to jump into the meat of the chapter itself. I'm going to start off in this lecture by sketching out Singer's overall argument strategy in this chapter, as well as in the academic paper that inspired this chapter and inspired the controversy over Singer's appointment to Princeton back in the 90s. This strategy has really two types of argument in it. On the one hand, Singer presents what is sometimes called the simple argument. The conclusion of the simple argument is that people in affluent, industrialized countries like the United States should be donating most, if not all, of their disposable or expendable income to helping people who are less fortunate, people who are in life-threatening situations as a result of poverty or famine or curable diseases, and so on. So it's a straightforward, deductive argument, and I'll give you a version of that argument. Rachel's also gives you a version at the very beginning of the chapter. And then we'll look at the second argument strategy that Singer employs, the strategy that's featured most prominently in the chapter that we read, but is also featured prominently in the original academic paper as well. And that strategy is to look at specific cases to try and see what it is that elicits what Singer takes to be pretty uniform and pretty strong intuitions and emotional reactions to the characters in these cases, and then to use that analysis in support of the conclusion of the simple argument and to motivate and make more likely to be true in the reader's mind the premises of the simple argument. So the strategy is largely the same as the strategy we saw him use in the paper on racial discrimination. Now, the first case that he looks at is a case based on a movie. Main character is a woman, Dora, and the protagonist in this particular case is a child that Dora takes to ostensibly be adopted, but who actually is going to be killed and have their organs used for transplants in rich patients. The second case that Singer looks at is the case of Bob. And like Dora, Bob is faced with a situation where he must choose whether or not to act in a way that is more altruistic or whether or not to act in a way that is more self-centered. Bob chooses the self-centered path just as Dora does, though their situations are different to some extent. And Singer wants to analyze these cases and show that our intuitions, in fact, support the premises of the simple argument and reinforce the conclusion of that simple argument. After he considers these cases, Singer then goes on to look at 4 objections to both his argument and the conclusion itself. The first objection that we'll look at, the class of objections really, are objections that center around a claim that the Dora case and the Bob case are strongly disanalogous to the case of the average person in an industrialized country like the United States, so that our intuitions in the Dora and the Bob case about what's the morally correct thing to do, they don't necessarily transfer over to the case of the average person in an industrialized Western country. We'll look at that argument, we'll look at Singer's objections to it, and then we'll turn to another kind of objection. And this kind of objection, I label this strategy the bandwagon strategy. And the idea here is that it looks at what the norm for behavior is in these countries, and it concludes that there are millions and millions and millions of people in these countries who could act in accordance with Singer's injunction in this article, but that they don't on a regular basis, that very few of them actually do. And because that is the norm or the standard, it would be inappropriate to label people who didn't go ahead and follow Singer's recommendations as immoral or acting in bad faith, because they're really just not deviating significantly from an established norm in these cultures. The next kind of objection is an objection that asserts that this argument and conclusion, much like utilitarianism generally, imposes obligations on people that are just ethically supererogatory. They're just above and beyond what you could reasonably expect the ethical agent to be required to perform. And hence, the problem with Singer's argument is really those underlying assumptions that are utilitarian in character. And we'll see how Singer responds to that. And then we'll turn to the final objection and his response, which I call the evolutionary argument. And this argument essentially says that human beings evolved with a particular psychological makeup, that particular psychological makeup or human nature isn't particularly altruistic, especially when it comes to strangers, and that asking people to behave in ways that are consistently quite contrary to their natural human nature is in fact not a reasonable thing to do, and hence people who don't deviate significantly from normal human nature by acting in these very altruistic fashion that Singer suggests are in fact not to be morally condemned. They're just acting in a way that's reasonable given the nature of human psychology. So what's Singer's argument strategy then? Well, in the article and the discussion of the article, both by Cupper and by Rachels, there are two argument strategies. Now, the first argument strategy isn't explicit in Singer's paper itself. It's explicit in an academic paper that he published and that inspired both the controversy surrounding his appointment to Princeton and controversy around his conclusions here. And that paper was called Famine, Affluence, and Morality. It was published in 1972. And the simple argument is explicitly given there. And it's mentioned by Rachel, it's mentioned by Cupper, and it's implicit in a lot of the article that we read in Rachel's volume. So the simple argument is going to conclude that one ought to use all or much of one's expendable or disposable income to help others whose lives are threatened by poverty, by famine, and other prolonged life-threatening conditions like this. It's a straightforward deductive argument with premises and a conclusion, and because it's a sort of an abstract theoretical argument, right, Singer also includes a second kind of argument strategy. And that second kind of argument strategy, which is both Famine and is featured prominently in our chapter, is to use particular cases that evoke relatively strong and uniform intuitions in people, and to analyze why it is that those intuitions are an appropriate response and are a response to these cases, and then use that analysis to further bolster both the premises and the conclusion of the simple argument. And so he considers two cases really in this chapter, a case about a woman called Dora and a case about a man called Bob. In Famine, Affluence, and Morality, he famously uses a case involving a professor and a drowning child in a pond.